Not yet? Okay. Aloha, everyone. Welcome to Lion Arboretum's Facebook Live. I'm Hadley Anderson. I'm the education specialist here at Lion. And with me today is our director, Zach Zahawi. And what we're talking about today, is, as we've been talking about the past 2 weeks with Tyler Swartz and with our interns, is career pathways into botanical sciences and some of the interesting routes we've taken to get to where we are here in Hawaii and at Lion Arboretum. So we're talking to Zach. He's got a varied background, so I'm going to let him go ahead and start. So Zach, where are you from?
That's always a loaded question for me. I'm from many places. So I was actually born in Lebanon, and I grew up there partly, and other countries in the Middle East. But I went to school in Ireland for secondary school, and then the U.S. for undergraduate and graduate. So I think of myself as being a piece of all of those different places.
Wow. Yeah, that is a definitely varied background. My background is I was born and raised in one town in Florida, and then I went to a school in Florida, and then I ended up here. So, but what made you choose the career path that you did, and how did you find that this was your interest and your passion?
Yeah, so I didn't actually start out in that field. I mean, my mother was an archaeologist, and so I grew up being outdoors very much and being in remote areas, and so that was really a part of me and my interest. But I actually started in geology, and so I essentially finished a degree in geology before stumbling into plant biology through friends and taking an elective course as an undergraduate, and that started me off on that pathway. But it wasn't tropical at the beginning. So
was it like paleobotany, or?
Actually, it's a good question. I really liked paleo and took a course in it as an undergraduate, and I think my father, or was it my mother, I can't remember, or maybe both of them both sort of looked at me and said, "What are you going to do with paleobotany?" So I sort of had to think of, expanding my interests a little bit. Yeah, I mean, and it was that, and actually, funnily enough, I had a friend. I went to undergraduate at the University of Texas, and I had a friend who was studying Mayan archaeology, and so he was the one who dragged me down to Mexico and Central America to one summer when he was down there doing field work, and as soon as I got immersed in those forests, I was hooked.
Fascinated.
And fascinated, and that just sent me off on a path to graduate school. And
was there a particular moment that you were like, "This is what I want to do"?
That was that trip, the first trip I took, and within the first couple of weeks of being in southern Mexico, in the sort of wet forest areas of Mexico, I was just so blown away by the experience and the sounds and the complexity of the vegetation and then the culture too. I mean, I grew up in if you will, third world countries, and there's a component of that there, and so suddenly it sort of felt like a connection as well, and so that was part of it. But really, it was the ecosystem and yeah.
Well, I imagine the ecosystem of Central and South American forests are probably very different from, first of all, Texas. And then going back further, like England and Ireland, and also
totally.
Lebanon and everything like that. So
I mean,
world.
Yeah, Ireland's a wet, temperate rainforest, if you will, right? So it's cold, but it's extremely green and rainy all the time. But it's not nearly as diverse, obviously. But yeah, so I've seen, and I actually kind of like the two extremes, so tropical wet forest, and I also, really appreciate desert environments as well, because of my mother in part, and I guess, growing up in the Middle East, there's lots of arid zones there that have a lot of appeal as well, and, a lot of weird adaptations of plants. So, you get to some really interesting things when you go into desert environments and how plants deal with those really harsh conditions. But what stuck for one reason or another was working in largely wet forests, not necessarily lowlands, sometimes up in mid-elevation. A lot of my work is in that area. And then, the other aspect that I think I had as a kid was always wanting to link whatever I did to some kind of applied aspect, some kind of connection to issues that we're dealing with as in the world, and it not be too abstract. Of, as fascinating as science is for the sake of science, I think we're in a different era today, and we can't afford that time.
And of course, looking back at if you talk about paleobotany and near extinction events and things like that, and then also looking forward to the future, and then some of the work that you've done with forest restoration in Central and South America, that's a very kind of poignant connection between the two eras, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, obviously extinction and evolution have been a part of geologic time throughout. It's just the rate and the pace that we're dealing with today that's so, shocking and drastic. And really there are no parallels in historical time apart from the, 5 major extinction events that we went through. And so, except that, of course, in none of those were we really a major player.
It was
at all.
Too far
in historical time. So, it's sobering.
Amazing. Okay, so going down to Central and South America and looking at the forest there and stuff like that, what were the next steps? Obviously, you were already into geology and everything like that, and how did you get from there? So that started it. What I started doing afterwards was looking for positions where I could volunteer down there on different projects, and I tagged along as an assistant on a couple of different projects, plant collecting expeditions, things like that, and eventually, there weren't anywhere near as many opportunities as there are now for undergraduates or immediately after undergraduate as there are now. So eventually, I wound up in grad school, and strangely enough, you have to go up to or at least I did, to the Midwest to study tropical restoration and conservation, which, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I wound up at the University of Illinois, which has a really strong program in tropical biology with a number of really prominent biologists in their department. And so, that led me to first Ecuador, where I did my master's work, and then in Honduras, where I did my PhD work. And then immediately after, or actually before I was even done with my PhD, I was hired by the Organization for Tropical Studies in Costa Rica, where I worked for essentially 15 years, give or take, before coming here. So, wow.
Yeah. 2 different positions within the organization at the time, but first as a faculty teaching undergraduate students about forest ecology and conservation, restoration and issues and policy and all kinds of things like that, and then taking over as director for the field station there.
Wow.
So, and all the while continue to do research. So I think that was really important to me to maintain my credentials and sort of keep abreast of the field as it developed and grew.
Of course, science is always changing too. There's new information that comes into play all the time.
Absolutely, and if you're not a part of that, you miss the boat. And so I think that's juggling that is not a simple thing. You can easily go down a rabbit hole of administrative duties or other things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis and neglect the research end.
And vice versa too.
And vice versa, so it's a balance. But it was the research end was always facilitated with me having a lot of collaborators, especially being director of a field station, you meet a lot of different scientists that are coming and going, and by being based there, you can sort of use that to sort of help link different projects up and build projects that way and seek funding. So.
Right. And so do you see a strong correlation between your work that you did in Central America and then also the kind of how we have invasives and indigenous species there, and then also invasive and indigenous species here as well, and some of the tropical plants that we study?
Sure, except that the parameters are almost flipped. So, and it, certainly you know of this as a scientist in the field of these differences between these two systems. What you don't realize is how stark that is, how sharp that contrast is. So, for example, I've always heard about the issue with invasive species and dealing with that in Hawaii and so on. But you don't really come to appreciate that as much until you're actually here and I think the first time it really struck me was on one of the courses I was sitting in on campus, and we were on a hike, and I was looking out across the valley, and I was looking at basically a forest of one species, and we'd been hiking on the other side of the ridge for a while, and I looked over there, and suddenly it dawned on me, and I looked at the faculty person leading the talk, and I said, "Is that guava over there?" And he said, "Yes." And I was completely floored because the entire side of the mountain was just that. And I've never seen, guava is native to Central America, so I know the species quite well, and it doesn't behave anything like that at all in Central America. So,
wow.
And then when you see that scale, it really sort of puts it in perspective for you. Another thing I would say is just talking to people. So, when I first came here, I was asked to give lots of talks about my research and so on, plans. And I would give, my talks all focused on restoration in tropical systems in Central America. And the first question that would come after I'd finished my talk is, what about invasive species? And, do you think that the work that you do there could be applied here? And the answer to the first one is, we don't care about invasive species in Central America because they're just not a problem.
Right.
They exist, but it's certainly not the biggest barrier to recovery in that part of the world. And then the second part, can some of those procedures or sort of methods be applied here? And the answer is generally no, because this is why I'm saying the parameters are flipped. You're sort of working here to push out invasive species to create a little microhabitat for native species so that they can, come back in and hopefully fend off, the onslaught of invasive species. Whereas in Central America, all you're doing is removing the driver of disturbance, which is usually something like, some human-induced disturbance, cattle grazing or what have you, agriculture, etc. And then you as long as there's patches of remnant forest around, that system will just bounce back.
Wow.
It takes time, but it does. So it's really a different approach. You're really having to think about different ways. And so if you let something go here, you're just going to get a bunch of invasive species. You're not going to get a native forest. If you stick a native plant out there and don't try and fence it off and do all these different measures that people do, that scientists do in Hawaii, you might as well not even do it because it's not going to survive.
Right.
So it's a really different set of circumstances.
Grow too slowly or anything like that, but they have in Central America, they have species that grow faster because they're competing in the rainforest anyway. Whereas over here, it was for so many years of evolution, they didn't have to grow very fast.
And it's species poor, comparatively speaking, for a tropical system, right? I mean, because it's so isolated as an island and so on, comparative areas with this kind of climatic conditions on the mainland have many, many, many more species. And that's just, a factor of just being isolated and a young system as well. So you're right, yeah. There's not nearly the scale of competition that they're dealing with on the mainland, Central America, Mexico, et cetera, as you have here. And of course, species there have been competing for limited resources for a far longer evolutionary time scale, and so they came here and just went bonkers.
Right, like things that make it good for their habitat just make them excellent in this one.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah,
That's awesome. Okay, well we are at our 10 minutes. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add about your experience in coming up in STEM and how you came to be in your career or anything like that. Or if anybody has any questions in the audience.
Advice for a young botanist.
Advice for a young botanist or somebody who is maybe doesn't know what they're going to do yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think what really helped with, you always think when you're in that stage and you're looking at your peers and elders sort of that they had a completely planned trajectory and everything fell into place. I had that feeling for my mother for years until one day I asked her and she sort of looked at me as if I was daft and said, no, you just sort of stumble around and I stumble in quotes, you obviously have interests and directions, but finding that niche that you really makes you sort of tick and feel good about your work and so on is not necessarily a straight line. I think the advice I would give for the students moving through the field now is, there are so many opportunities out there to gain experience in different aspects of biology, different lines of research, both here in Hawaii and abroad. Of course, we're dealing with a pandemic now, but presumably when hopefully we get past that, and the world sort of opens up again and these opportunities come back, I think that's a really fantastic way to figure out whether this is the right path or the wrong path. And also, I would say, ease up on the accelerator pedal. So there's a real sensation, more so now, that you just got to go through undergrad, you got to hit grad school, you got to just move. And it actually pays to take a step back and spend some time, just having a bit of on-the-ground experience before moving to the next step. And
maybe spend some time volunteering at your local arboretum.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Just to see what those career pathways or what interests you, and just try it out too.
But that's in all seriousness, it's a great option because we do have many different departments here with different lines of research and different interests and so on. So I think those are really good examples of what you can do.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Zach.
Absolutely.
Thank you for doing a Facebook Live with us and talking about your past and how you came up to be in the STEM field. And we want to thank all of you guys for joining us. And this will be, of course, posted after we conclude this interview. And it's going to be posted on our YouTube account as well. So stay tuned on our social media and our website for any upcoming news that we might have, any kind of sales we might be having. So double check that because we might have some news for you in the future. And with that, ahui ho. We'll see you next time.